Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Deborah McDowell, and please forgive me. I think you can still hear me talking through my mask. I'm just almost hysterical about mask wearing, so bear with me both in terms of some muffling and poor aesthetics. I'm glad for your presence here as we launch our website connected to the Julian Bond Papers Project. I want to thank again our co-sponsors, the Memory Project associated with the Karsh Institute, and the Center for Digital Editing. Do we have the programs here? Yeah, I guess we can handle it. I asked for the programs so that we had a little information about the panelists. We're going to keep things tight and devote as much time as we can to the discussion itself. I think I mentioned that I'm Deborah McDowell, and I am directing the Julian Bond Papers Project with a small and very, very dedicated team, including, thank you, Laura Baker, who is the managing editor, James Perla there behind the camera, who is the project manager. Our student interns, we are most happy about the involvement of students at every stage of this project. Hana, Tolliver, Anoosha, forgive me for not last names. Anoosha, yes, I'm sorry, Anoosha. And then our panelists. The Julian Bond Papers Project, I'll let people come in and take their seats. Marita! Sweet. Everybody knows I'm just I love little children, and it's hard to contain myself in their presence. The Julian Bond Papers Project began first as a modest project connected to 50 over 5, remembering the modern movement for civil rights, a sequence of courses which I began to teach 10 years ago. 50 over 5 refers to the series of 50th anniversaries from 2013 to 2018, which marked watershed events in the development of the modern civil rights movement. The project moved from this relatively silent phase to a celebrated public launch of a different kind, beginning in August 2018, when we hosted a community-based, crowdsourced transcribe-a-thon commemorating 3 years since Bond's passing. The project gained immediate national attention and press coverage in both 2018 and 2019 when we held the second event. Of course, then COVID interrupted. The Transcribe-a-thon served as a community engagement project which embodied Julian Bond's primary values of education, grassroots organizing, and community action. As he noted frequently in speeches and interviews, the civil rights movement consisted of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. This event proved further significant in the context of Charlottesville, Virginia, as it provided a space to engage with the themes of organizing and activism as the city marked the anniversary of the deadly white supremacist rally of August 2017. Bond's civic and social justice values guide the work of this project as we seek to preserve and make accessible the intellectual legacy of this important figure in American history, while at the same time involving community participation yoked hand in hand with those committed to observing the rigorous and meticulous standards of academic scholarship in the digital sphere. This afternoon, we are focusing on Bond's speeches, but one area of this massive archive, which consists of 47,000 documents. The speeches alone, written and delivered from the 1970s forward, total roughly 5,000 pages and provide Bond's responses to a range of critical events, including the Kent State murders, racial segregation, Bond's own potential presidential run, as well as the failures of the Nixon, Carter, and Reagan presidential administrations. Other documents focus on Democratic Party strategies, the Republicans' contract with America, ongoing debates around Roe versus Wade, responses to the Million Man March, and commemorations of Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Many of these speeches concern topics that retain their relevance and continue to reverberate in contemporary debates. The U.S. healthcare system, specifically racial disparities in healthcare and outcomes, the housing crisis, labor conditions, income and wealth distribution, economic inequality, police brutality, media monopolies, and the continuing battle against fascism. As such scholars as Robert Greene have noted, from almost the outset of his career, Bond was writing from within the milieu of a Black freedom movement that inspired and was inspired by other movements in pursuit of freedom, justice, and equality elsewhere in the world, including African liberation movements broadly and the anti-apartheid movement specifically. In many of these speeches, we see him moving often seamlessly from domestic campaigns to international policy, demonstrating the spirit of Martin Luther King's statement in The World House, the last chapter of his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, 1967. There, King wrote, "In one sense, the civil rights movement in the United States is a special American phenomenon, which must be understood in the light of American history and dealt with in terms of the American situation. But on another and equally important level, what is happening in the United States today is a significant part of a world development." While the series in the Bonds paper will remain relevant for the foreseeable future, it appears, their contents are particularly pertinent to the current political climate with its resurgence of social justice movements, community organizing, and student activism. The current campaigns for removing Confederate symbols, defunding police, abolishing prisons, defending reproductive freedoms, and promoting climate change reforms and policies finds echoes and antecedents in documents throughout the Bond papers, the speeches, again, most especially. Throughout the collection, Bond also speaks to political divisions, legislative and judicial functions, and the role of everyday Americans in interpreting, building, and sustaining their own democracy. For Julian Bond, democracy must be fought for, and on various fronts. For him, again, as Robert Greene has noted, fighting for freedom in the streets, in the classrooms, and in the halls of power could indeed, must indeed, occur simultaneously. Reading his speeches, we are reminded that the challenges of forging a principled yet practical path forward are nothing new, but his speeches offer us some blueprints for moving forward, some guides for we who struggle to meet these challenges in our deeply unsettling times. As we are here at this university where Bond taught for over 20 years, reaching thousands of students, he offers us a possible blueprint for thinking about democracy within academic contexts. I personally hold out hope that his work might inspire more of us to think about what a few contemporary scholars term research justice, a strategic and epistemological framework and methodological intervention that aims to transform structural inequalities in academic space and within academic scholarship. This issue is much with us in the current debates surrounding the College Board and its clumsy rollout of the African American Studies component of the AP course. Julian Bond's life and work, grounded from the beginning in communities on the ground, provides us a possible foundation for a return to the earliest foundations of Black studies as an academic enterprise. A foundation that was community-centered and focused on socially just activities. A movement in search of legitimizing different forms of knowledge and different forms of knowledge production. Such scholarly research holds the potential to reshape the relationship between the university and its publics. It also contributes to the transvaluation of scholarship and knowledge in academia. In other words, work which centralizes community engagement often runs the risk of lying athwart the quote-unquote knowledge most valued and most rewarded in academia, particularly in research-run universities. For this reason, scholars are often reluctant to pursue academic projects centralizing community engagement, fearing, and not unreasonably, that such work is neither valued nor supported, particularly if it does not conform to strict disciplinary protocols on the basis of which promotion and tenure are awarded. I think of Julian Bond, then, as encouraging us to pursue research questions, activities, methodologies focused on regional and national urgencies, regional, national, and global urgencies, and on service to society, including service to the society of academia. Thank you very much.
I can't wait to hear the panel either, so I won't take much of your time, but we are here to show you our new website. If you like what you see and what you hear today, we will be launching about between 100 and 150 documents every June, so check back. We'll be talking about a lot of serious things, but I have a wonderful job because I get to work with students and I get to read Julian Bond's words every day, and not only does he remind me that much of the work of social justice is not at big rallies, but it's actually, he says, in the ones and twos of the people who actually get all the work done. But he's also really funny. He calls Governor George Wallace the hillbilly Hitler. He refers to J. Edgar Hoover as the little tyrant who runs the Federal Bureau of Intimidation. And he's actually quite a fan of what I can only call dad jokes. In a 1970s political diary, so he was quite young when he said this. He said he was doing lots and lots of traveling at the time. While waiting at LaGuardia Airport, I see Dan Rather of CBS, who wants to know what I think. I want to know what he thinks. We agree to call each other if we find out. But he's always saying, I really do end every one of my work days inspired because he's always talking about how we need to make change by moving beyond discussion and into action. So, since we're here to talk about our new website, we have a short video introducing it to you. We hope that you will visit it in the months to come, and then we'll get into our panel. So, thank you.
Introducing the Julian Bond Papers Project Digital Edition, bondpapersproject.org. Our mission is to make the archives of civil rights icon Julian Bond freely available to the global public. Our work will allow you to explore tens of thousands of documents, from correspondence to paper drafts, speeches, and audiovisual materials, providing a glimpse into the mind of a leading American civil rights activist who participated in 7 decades of history in the making. All of the documents in the digital edition are discoverable by date, author, topic, and type. Every document has archival quality images of the manuscripts themselves. We catalog, photograph, and digitize every page, beginning with Bond's speech series. We work closely with the digital production group at the University of Virginia to create the highest quality images, ensuring long-term sustainability and use. Every document has a word-searchable transcription, published first as a raw version, a stage we call early access. While our editors will eventually describe the context, people, and places in Bond's work, we don't want users to have to wait to gain access to his words, so we publish the documents immediately and while we are still working on them. Every transcription can be downloaded as a PDF version. By making Julian Bond's documents available for free as soon as we have a verified transcription and offering downloads for educational use, we hope these materials can be useful to scholars, students, and people everywhere interested in the process of maintaining our American democracy through social justice organizing. Our editorial team is grateful to our many partners as we seek to publish Julian Bond's entire manuscript collection. Hundreds of volunteers have helped us generate thousands of pages of base transcriptions. After those transcriptions are reviewed and published as early access documents, our editors will then add historical context and republish the documents, creating a complete scholarly annotated digital edition. Ultimately, the project will also publish a 3-volume thematically organized print series called The Essential Julian Bond. In Julian Bond's own spirit of little d democratic practices, the Julian Bond Papers Project is a true collaboration. The project works with students who serve as editorial apprentices, learning and practicing digital image, data, and editing skills. We work in true partnership with the Center for Digital Editing, with special thanks to Erica Cavanaugh for providing our beautiful site design. Along with Jennifer Sturzer and staff, the CDE maintains our entire digital infrastructure. We are grateful to the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library, where Bond manuscripts are stored. We are especially grateful to the National Archives NHPRC for granting our project our first full-time funding opportunity. There is so much to learn from the 50 years of social justice service that define the life and work of Julian Bond. We hope you will visit, explore, and join us in extending Julian Bond's legacy into the future with bondpapersproject.org. In Julian Bond's own words, we move forward fastest when we move forward together.
Thank you very much, Laura. And again, Erica, would you please stand? Erica Cavanaugh from the Center for Digital Editing, and to her we owe much of this website design, along with every other thing. And Katie Blitzer also from the Center for Digital Editing. This is truly a collaborative project. Okay, so let us begin. And we'll begin with a kind of ice-breaking question. Julian Bond often wrote about the importance of examining our present in relation to our past, or then in relation to our now. The speeches we have selected for our panelists to discuss this afternoon, most written in the 70s and 80s, invite us to examine the conditions and urgencies that Bond outlined in those decades in relation to the conditions and urgencies of this moment. What does such an examination reveal? So any one of our panelists can begin to address this question.
We didn't flip a coin or anything.
No. Oh, no, this was always going to be informal.
Yes.
So.
Okay, start.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. McDowell, for the opportunity to participate in this panel with my esteemed colleagues here, and certainly an honor, so thank you. I had a great time reading these speeches. Wow, that's all. And the first thing I thought about is that these speeches revealed to me that not only was Bond a very important and significant civil rights activist, but I never thought about him as being kind of a conduit between the civil rights generation and then the post-civil rights generation going on into the 1970s and 1980s. And there was one speech that really resonated with me, and that was the speech that he gave at the conference on the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And one passage really stuck out for me in which he said, "For as we have reaped the benefits of the social activism of the 60s, too many of us have fallen into the sleep of the 70s, lulled into calm by a large number of black faces in high places." And that really struck me, and for so many reasons. And I could not help but think about, when I read that passage, that Bond was talking about, he was speaking in a very, transitional kind of period. And it reminded me of a speech that Du Bois gave in 1948 before Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, when he critiqued the Boule for kind of falling into this slumber and this kind of lull and not really picking up the mantle and carrying on the activism that had been started in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And I couldn't help but think about that. And so Bond in this speech is really a call to action as well. And so this theme runs throughout all of the speeches. And I noticed that, and that's something that I hope that we'll talk a little bit about later as we proceed.
Thank you, Derrick. I sense you want to speak, Kevin.
Well, I mean, just to follow from Derrick's point, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this event. It's always an honor to be associated with Julian Bond. And as Derrick said, reading these speeches reminded me of how scholars of the civil rights movement used to talk about the issue and in public discourse. And I remember, when I was in graduate school in the 80s and just starting my career in the 90s, a lot of people referring to the post-civil rights era. And these speeches reminded me that, certainly in the mind of Julian Bond and hopefully many others, the civil rights movement was continuing, that it was really, I think, misleading to speak of a post-civil rights era. And so, Derrick, your point about Bond as a sort of a conduit between the generation of civil rights activists and the sort of rising generations is really spot on. I think that comes through very strongly in the speeches that we read. But I remember Julian Bond through these years, and he made a lot of media appearances as someone who was keeping the message of the movement and the movement alive, and who was adapting how people thought of the movement, adding causes for, thinking about the movement as part of a larger rights revolution that encompassed issues of gender, sexuality, disability, etc. And so Bond is someone who was really important in really sort of translating the movement and keeping it alive in the minds of certainly folks coming of age through those years. I'll just leave it at that, and we'll just revisit some of the speeches.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Phyllis?
Well, again, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I want to go to the part of the question that says, Bond, the speeches invite us to examine the conditions and urgencies in those decades in relation to the conditions and urgencies of the moment. And really, when I read these speeches and other things that I'm familiar with that he has written, it feels like the urgencies of the moment are in many ways the same urgencies of the 60s and the 70s. And, they've changed somewhat, and Julian Bond recognized some of those changes even into the 70s. I mean, if we just take the first speech, the conference on the 1965 Voting Rights Act, he says, we're living in the backlash of the 60s. And he talks about, the fact that, that politics determines everything that happens. And he talks about the war in Vietnam, unemployment for blacks. And then he says, but politics can really make the difference. The right kind of politics can be transformative for the society. And so in this conference on the Voting Rights Act, he is calling attention to the things that haven't changed. And all I could think of is what we're living with today. What we're living with today in terms of the efforts to turn back whatever kind of progress we've made in voting rights, to deny people the opportunity to register, to limit the voting by mail, through this myth of voter fraud, to try to control the ways in which states manipulate elections. So, that's just one example, and I think there are many other examples in this speech that we can look to. And I love in these speeches, and I know this to be true, of all the ways, and I'll just put this out there, it might be going in a slightly different direction, the ways in which he uses language to make incredible points, and I especially love the ways in which he uses alliteration.
Oh, yes, Phyllis. No, that's not going far afield. Please do. That's it. And I have some examples for you here.
So just in this very first speech, I just wrote this down, and he says, cruel and callous castrators in Washington, D.C. moved with cold calculation to kill. And he talks about all of the ways in which in which the opportunity for student loans, for public housing, for urban renewal, are being sort of attacked in the 70s, the pullback in social services. And then he says, again, using great alliteration, political pimps who endorse candidates not because they are good, but because they will win. They respect no party or principle. And I just thought, if we just look what's going on today in terms of the halls of our Congress.
Indeed.
That statement could have been made by him yesterday.
This morning. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'll just come in here too. As a student of literature, of course, I am especially attuned to the literary qualities of Bond's work. He was a wonderful writer. And that comes through in everything. And yes, had a great penchant for alliteration. That then could just break you into stitches. Yes, so absolutely, as we look at these speeches for these questions of socio-political urgencies, we should not lose sight of the fact that Bond was a very accomplished writer and a poet. One of his favorite poems was just a very short poem. See that girl, shake that thing. And I'm forgetting the second one. But he wrote poetry. So this was, he was an English major. And so when English majors sometimes get mocked and laughed at, but I take great comfort in knowing that Julian Bond was an English major. Okay, all right. Any other responses to this question about the ways in which in the 70s and 80s speeches, Bond is prefiguring the urgencies of now?
You said something earlier when you mentioned King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. And in that text, there's a sense that King is preparing us for the next generation of Black leadership in the movement. And I would argue that Bond takes that tradition further along. And in many ways, it's a manifestation of what King was talking about, particularly his comments about the World House that you mentioned there, because you see that theme also running throughout Bond's speeches, which I'll talk about later.
Okay, all right. Bond actually had a speech that he delivered, and you can find on YouTube. Many of the speeches are available on YouTube as they were being delivered. Not all, but it's quite wonderful to be able to hear them, because as you know, he has this deep, engaging baritone voice, and that's just immediately arresting. So much like King, there's benefit to be derived from reading the speeches, but there's even greater benefit to be derived from listening to them. And so in a speech he gave in 2005 called Civil Rights Then and Now, The Quest for Meaningful Equality, you can hear him pretty much saying in efficient, pithy form, now we find ourselves refighting old battles we thought we had already won. Refighting old battles we thought we'd already won. So let's move along. Julian Bond never shied away from a direct confrontation with race and with the architecture of white supremacy. In a 2014 speech, From Civil War to Civil Rights, which Bond delivered the year before his death, he writes, "Those who say race is history have it exactly backward. History is race. The word America, scrambled after all, spells I am race. And America is race," he continued, "from its symbolism to its substance," again that alliteration, "from its founding by slaveholders to its rending by the Civil War, from Johnny Reb to Jim Crow, from the Ku Klux Klan to Katrina, from Emmett Till to Trayvon." So we might discuss here how we see this argument being reinforced throughout the collection of speeches you were handed. The centrality of race and its inextricability, almost any conversation we might name, especially regarding democratic policies, especially regarding civil rights and social justice.
I think the speech where he talks about the struggle over Confederate monuments really shows this approach, and I think this is a approach that you see in many of his speeches. He's always writing about a current issue or crisis, but he's always situating it within a longer history. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, his discussion of the Confederate monuments really, I think, underlies the fact that the mobilization to defend Confederate monuments is really part of a Republican Party agenda. And you know, Bond, I think, in many of the speeches, wants to connect the dots between sort of a current conservative GOP project and a longer tradition of white supremacy that is, you know, enshrined in these Confederate monuments. You know, the speech is also a reminder that this issue of removing Confederate monuments is not something that just sort of sprung up in Charlottesville in recent years.
Right.
That's been a key goal of civil rights activists in local, you know, of local movements, mm-hmm. certainly in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. I mean, the NAACP organized massive marches, you know, calling for the removal of the Confederate flag from the state capitol grounds, which was only, I guess, recently achieved in 2015. But, you know, local movements to remove monuments. And so, in the 1990s, when he gave this speech, which is a very bleak time in the race relations in the United States, a time of racial backlash, this issue of Confederate monuments and memorial was a very active issue. And you know, Bond, I think, really calls attention to that. There was a movement, I recall, in those years, you know, neo-Confederate yes. folks who were trying to sort of shift the conversation about the Confederacy, and a lot of sort of ideological, sort of low-level ideological warfare. But I think we can see today that the consequences of that, you know, are quite profound in helping us understand how we're in the place that we're in politically right now.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And members of the audience should also feel free, if you want to join in. We will reserve a little bit of time at the end for questions from you, but if in the course of this conversation you're moved to respond, please don't hesitate. Okay. Anyone else want to respond to? Go ahead, Phyllis.
Well, I want to respond to the phrase when he says, those who say race is history have it exactly backward. History is race. Mm-hmm. And in that very speech that you were talking about, I think that happened at the Southern Historical Association.
That's right.
It was a comment on a couple of papers that were being given. Mm-hmm. And he says at the end of that very talk, the symbols from the past can't be separated from the past they represent. And I think that notion that history is race is then represented in that sort of final line of the talk. And so that's one element of a response to your question. The other is that when you think of the notion history is race, I think one of the most striking and significant aspects of these speeches is just over and over again to see how he talks about systemic injustice. He doesn't always use the word systemic, but it's there in every single talk that he gives. And so he is able to see whether it's about mental health or voting rights or Confederate monuments, how these are all of a piece and they all somehow speak to the impact of the way that history is race.
Yes, yes. And you know, you're mentioning that in a later question pertaining to another speech, you speak on the importance of mental health and how we get the teeming masses in need of mental health who have no access to mental health care, who have no access to it. That before we can grant that access, we have to understand the etiology and So Julian is always providing us with the etiology of a phenomenon. He is constantly talking about, including in that speech about mental health, what he calls the ecology, I have to find it here, the ecological unity of all things, you know. And it's such an elastic understanding of the concept of ecology. But again and again, from speech to speech, there is exactly as you suggest, this discussion of things that are systemic, whether he is using that term or not, because he recognizes this ecological unity among binding a range of phenomena.
Interconnected
Yes.
all these issues.
And, you know, to that point, Phyllis, it just reminds me that he was the publicity director for SNCC. And so his task was to, you know, document instances of, you know, racial discrimination and atrocities, and, you know, to really sort of create a record, a public record of those things to, you know, sort of galvanize, you know, public awareness around these issues. And, you know, he does that really powerfully in the speech on voting rights, the speech that he gave in 1975, where he talks about all kinds of violations of the Voting Rights Act that are happening in Mississippi. So he's returning to, you know, that sort of political project of SNCC, of trying to unearth and disclose all of these, you know, sort of violations, all these examples of systemic racism that were invisible to the public at large, but you know, the efforts of SNCC brought to public attention, you know, out of the limelight. You know, Deborah, you mentioned his sonorous voice before.
Yes.
And one place that you all can hear this is in the documentary series, Eyes on the Prize. I'm sure it's available. Eyes on the Prize, I think it ran from like the late 1980s and early 1990s, and he's the narrator of that documentary series. So, and it's a great record, historical documentary of the civil rights movement.
It absolutely is. Absolutely. Anybody else? Yes, Eric. Okay, Eric.
I just want to extend the comments of my panelists here, fellow panelists, in that I was struck by the ease with which Bond was able to marshal social science data and history to make his points.
Yes.
And it was just fascinating for someone you know, who was as young as he was when he was making these speeches. And I started thinking, where did he get the skill from? I mean, he's just brilliant. But I could not help but think when he gave his speech in 1978 before the Psychiatric Association, it sounded familiar, it sounded very familiar, and I couldn't help but think of his father's book, The Education of the Negro in American Social Order.
Yes.
And I said, yeah.
That's where he got it.
That's the context within which he grew up. He heard this. His father was a historian, but he was a social science trained historian at Chicago.
Yes.
And I can hear that in Julian's speeches.
Yeah, you absolutely can. You wanted to add something?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much for that comment. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amber Henry. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Woodson. And building off of that intro quote about going further together, I'm curious, who were the kind of unlikely friendships that Bond was interacting with, people that inspired him, and kind of where he's the trajectory that he's falling into in terms of individuals, I guess.
Certainly my father, but also I'm thinking about this photograph of Horace Mann Bond and a young Julian Bond with W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And we know that Horace Mann Bond, Julian's father, was influenced by Du Bois, right? So I think I would just, and also, who else would be up there? Well, those are the people who come to my mind right now, but he was in that context, right?
And there's a similar iconic photograph of him sitting on the knee of Paul Robeson.
That's right, that's where I was. Yes.
So this is because of who his father was. Julian is exposed to various luminaries, politicians, you name it, that was in the air he breathed, that in fact, they wouldn't have been quote unquote celebrities to him. They would have been people with whom he interacted, you know, on a regular basis. And
His mother was a librarian.
yeah, his mother, and he never lost an opportunity to stress that his mother was a librarian. He was an avid reader, a voracious reader, and indeed his speeches are informed by research. He's not just simply talking off the top of his head. He is typically providing a range of data from his research. So indeed, and again, Bond is, we haven't mentioned it, but SNCC is very much, and Julian and many other members of SNCC never lost an opportunity to celebrate Ella Baker, from whom they learned a great deal, from whom they learned about social and political organizing, among a range of other things. And so Ella, when we talk about the influences on him, we would also be remiss if we did not include Ella Baker. Go ahead, Laura.
And Miss Fannie Lou Hamer.
Fannie Lou Hamer as well.
One of my favorite speeches that we published last year is his handwritten draft of a memorial speech he wrote about her. And the deference to Miss Baker and Miss Hamer are everywhere in his speeches.
Yes, because, excuse me, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Ella Baker, because she's probably the one single person most responsible for the founding of SNCC.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and what Ella Baker taught, and he may have learned alliteration and certainly pithy, hard-hitting statements from Ella Baker. Strong people don't need strong leaders. Ella Baker was dead set against the idea of the iconic leader, that leadership that the people know what they need. People know what they need, and if they have an opportunity, they will tell you. They don't need spokespersons. And so, indeed, Ella Baker taught Julian Bond, as did Fannie Lou Hamer for that matter, about democracy on the ground, in the people. Indeed, Julian Bond's own first political campaign reflected those teachings, because he walked the dirt roads of Georgia, knocking on the doors of people living in tar paper shacks, asking them what they would want from a politician. Not, I'm here and I'm going to tell you, vote for me and I'll set you free, but I want to hear what you want for me should I be elected.
And, you go ahead.
Thank you. So if we're moving toward issues of leadership, Julian also said that he was influenced in his style of leadership from his early years at the George School.
Yes.
Which was
Yes,
a Quaker
school.
Where every student at the school had tasks they had to do. And he said no one was too good to work. And he said he carried that with him through his life, and then that was reinforced. Also, the concept of speaking truth to power, he said he got out of those Quaker principles, which he then carried through for the rest of his life, and he is on record in that interview in the Exploration of Black Leadership series. He's on record of saying that Ella Baker reinforced what he had already known.
Yes.
And one thing I think I just would like to say, if we're talking about leadership, is I think he just exuded those principles all through his life.
She toured through the South during the war, basically meeting with people in church basements and organizing chapters of the NAACP. She built the sort of the infrastructure as an organizer for the modern civil rights movement throughout the South. And then she is the executive director of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King in the late 1950s, and she's basically a glorified secretary, although she's the executive director. And she's still an organizer. She's going to King and the leaders of the SCLC with ideas about voter education projects, and they're just saying, not not today. And so when the sit-in movement breaks out, and all, hundreds of black students throughout the South stage these nonviolent direct action protests to desegregate lunch counters throughout the South, Ella Baker takes SCLC funds and organizes a conference at Shaw University in Raleigh to basically plan the next steps from the sit-in movement. And she basically tells the students, Dr. King wants you to work for SCLC. The NAACP wants to harness your energy for that organization. Why don't you form your own organization and then, craft a vision of social justice that goes beyond desegregating lunch counters? What happens when you desegregate the lunch counters and you can't afford the price of lunch?
Yes.
So that's the genesis of SNCC, and all of the SNCC leaders, Julian Bond, Robert Moses,
Cleveland Sellers.
Yes, all of them. And Ella Baker's philosophy was you didn't need a charismatic leader to sort of parachute into town and lead a movement. Right. You were better off just organizing in local communities, and that philosophy of grassroots organizing led to the emergence of people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper and just a dynamic leader who commanded the national stage during the 1964 Democratic Convention. So Ella Baker is a really crucial person for understanding SNCC and the civil rights movement.
And understanding Julian. Yeah, yes. Absolutely the case. The time is getting away from us, but but I think this is a testament to how rich these speeches are and how exciting Julian Bond's life and legacy are to many of us. But I want to make sure our student interns get into this conversation, because from the beginning of this project, in fact, even before it was the Julian Bond Papers Project, we were working with students, largely with James Perla, in what we were calling then the movement in the archive. So we have always involved students, and the reason being is that is one of the best ways to honor Julian's memory, because he began his career as a student organizer. And so we knew that to put it positively, we wanted students involved in every phase of this project's development. So I want to, I pose this question to you all about student activism and the challenges that Julian gave to student activists. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the impact of working in the archives on your thinking about whatever comes to your mind. Okay.
Yeah, I've been working with this project for probably a little over 2 years. And just like I've probably read hundreds of his speech, transcribing them and photographing them and scanning them, and then also like taking my time to really understand what he's trying to say, because like you guys were saying earlier, so much of it is still so relevant today, and it doesn't even feel like the speeches were written in like the 70s or 80s or 90s. Like he's talking about education reform, voter reform, he's talking about the economy and like problems with capitalism, especially Black Americans, and how they're so disenfranchised, and systemic racism. He's talking about all of it, and all of it is so pertinent to today as well. And especially, he has a lot of speeches about universities and student organizing, and all of that is obviously very important to me. And I just think it's been great like working with this project, because it's kind of like killing two birds with one stone. Like I get to be a part of something that I know is gonna like leave a mark, because these speeches like deserve to be read and analyzed by students and activists and everyone. And then I also get the chance to like kind of just sit and read his words and like, really get to know who he was and like how he was an activist, but a leader and a teacher. And it's been like really special to work with all this documents.
Tolliver, you want to add anything?
Sure. I would agree with Anoosha. It's been an amazing opportunity to work with this project, and I think honestly the question that we've already spoken to that would speak to this the best is the first question, because I think one of the things that I was most surprised about once I was getting my hands on this work and interacting with it, is how familiar the language is itself. The issues he's talking about, the anxieties that he's expressing, the things that he's hopeful about, they're all very familiar to the problems that we are facing today. And then doubly, I was very, very surprised by how he does not abandon students on any of the issues that he's talking about. He really is looking for them in every single thing that he's worried about or that he's hopeful about. He really does see students as helpful in these movements and as possessing a certain ability to see what's going to come in a way that is aiding a movement rather than harming it in any way. So that's something that I have found really, really special in working on this. And I think to what we were speaking about before, about Bond being sort of a conduit during his time and a bridge, it's the same way that he is now, I would say, a light. I think this road, as a student personally, can be dark at times, can feel uncertain, but when you are reading his work, you can see him sort of guiding the way and talking about things that, even if at times it can feel a little bit discouraging, that we are still having these conversations, we are still posing these questions and searching for answers. It's also very comforting to know that he is thinking about you in the 70s and in the 60s when he's writing these things. Maybe not you specifically, but it can feel that way, and it can feel that personal. So, we were just earlier talking about critical race theory, and we were thinking about his speeches and things that he talked about in his work, and I think that itself is just a beautiful thing, that we are able to still continue the dialogue with him and to have him here present with us, and I think that's why this project is so special, because it works to make sure that his legacy has survived. We are fourth years, so we also are thinking about leaving his legacy for students that are coming now, for students that will be here even after we leave, in the way that he was thinking about us as students.
Oh, our students are so eloquent. They are so eloquent, aren't they? Hannah?
Adding on to what Tolliver and Anoosha said, it's been a pleasure working with this project, and it's been very motivating for me and inspiring, knowing that the work that I do is making his work accessible to everyone and able for people to read anywhere in the world. I do think his messages, like Tolliver said, are extremely relevant and are still important today. And as someone who is planning on also as a fourth year trying to graduate and go on to graduate school, I'm very interested in public health, and one of his really big topics that he speaks about is health care and universal health coverage in America. And it's extremely interesting that even though he was rallying for these things in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it's still an issue today. And to know that he was, again, interested in our rights today and that we're still having these conversations, it's extremely inspiring to me to try and continue his legacy in working with the project.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you. I want to be sure that the audience gets a little bit of time. Let's take, if you can, maybe 10 more minutes to field questions from you, and then we can continue conversation over drinks and refreshments. Anything that moves you? Yes, Robert.
Thank you, Professor McDowell. Thank you, everyone, for coming and being part of this extraordinary panel. I want to start with something Professor Alridge said earlier about Julian Bond being connected between the civil rights generation and the post-civil rights generation. I was born in 1968. I suppose I regard myself as part of the post-civil rights generation. And my first real understanding of Julian Bond was through the Odds and Price series, his narration. And then digging deeper into his own involvement. And so this is as a college student, as the Odds and Price series were coming out. And there are many things that are remarkable about that series. The imagery, particularly the music.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking through how Julian Bond, connecting to a post-civil rights generation, might have thought about, for instance, the Afrocentric age, if you will, of hip-hop in the late 80s, early 90s. Was he connected? Did he feel that there were younger musical artists of any genre who kept that spirit and music tied to political activism, tied to certain histories of struggle. The comment on that, do you have connections? The other question is broadly, I think we all have a sort of broad familiarity of how we thought of the civil rights movement of the 60s being contextualized in a large decolonization movement in Africa and his anti-apartheid activism in the 80s. I'm less familiar with his engagement with decolonization struggles in the 1970s, particularly his Portuguese colonialism that basically ties up in 1975, the struggle that leads to independence Zimbabwe in 1980. What is his commentary there and those movements in that decade of 1970? So do you have a lot of writing there, commentary?
Yes. Not always in specific forms, though Laura and you, but sometimes so. He is constantly alluding to the ways in which the civil rights movement took, as I think I said in the opening remarks, took inspiration from other movements for independence in Africa, and then those movements were in turn inspired by the civil rights movement. And so there are occasional references, I think, more explicit about the anti-apartheid movement. Laura, can you add anything here?
I would have to, I can get you some references after specifically, but really, I see it tied to his SNCC organizing training, but almost every American issue he ties to global empire. And he talks about white supremacy and capitalism and Black Americans as colonized, and therefore their lot is tied with every other colonized people in the world. And he's saying this in the 60s, and he's saying it in the 70s, and he's saying it in the 80s, and I'm only now starting to read the 90s speeches. So I'm guessing he said it till 2015 when he died. And specific names of places, but I would like to find more references for you.
Yeah. And the last, I forgot to add this piece to my very long question already. But we associate him as part of the nonviolent tradition. And I'm wondering, in this thinking through decolonization, particularly in Africa in the 70s and 80s, what is his take on armed struggle, the place of armed struggle in decolonization? Does he think through that? And King was thinking through these questions too. Do we have a record of bonding through that question?
Sure. Let me get Derrick in here, and then and others can join in too.
I don't have a deep response to your question, but I will tell you a story. In the summer of 2000, I was attending a NEH institute called Teaching the Civil Rights Movement in Bond Museum. Professor Bond was there. And Leon Litwack gave a lecture that day about the role of hip-hop and rap music in this new book, right? And it was fascinating. And after we had a conversation back and forth between all of us. And we asked Professor Bond, what did he think about the lecture and what was said? And I remember him saying, I wish I would have followed up with him. I remember him saying that that most social movements have that music component, and you love music. And so he was very supportive of what he was hearing. Particularly, that was a period when you had what we call socially political conscious hip hop. It was really the thing then. He was supportive of that, and I didn't follow up with the conversation.
The other thing that could be added, well, first I'll say, we're talking about 5,000 speeches. So we're still making our way, and they will be searchable. So we will be able to answer these questions about specific sites. But for sure, the music, one of Julian Bond's most famous lectures, which he gave again and again and again to alumni of Virginia, was Crossing the Color Line. Rhythm and Blues and Rock and Roll. I may have the title off just by a little bit. But he's aware of the force and the power of music to bridge differences. And so he's really talking about music as a connector, and particularly across racial difference. And I still have on my phone, I could call up on my phone now, Julian constantly sent me playlists. And so, listen to this, listen to that. I mean, like every other week. Did you know about him? He was deep into popular music that wasn't always, or musical groups that didn't always make the popular music, what do you call those things? Charts, exactly. Yes. Thank you, Phyllis. So yes, he was a lover of music, and I don't know, looked like you wanted to say something too.
Laura spoke to the issue of his internationalism. He was, which was an outgrowth of SNCC. I mean, SNCC was the first civil rights organization to oppose the Vietnam War, and Bond, of course, was denied his seat in the Georgia legislature because of SNCC's position against the war. So, and in the years to come, with the influence of the Black Panthers, the mobilizations around Angela Davis and to free Angela Davis, he was a very strong supporter of what people would probably consider the sort of radical wing of black politics at that time. He was active in the anti-apartheid movement, and I think there's a speech of his excerpted in this anthology. It's like a primary source reader of the anti-apartheid movement called No Easy Victories. You're probably familiar with it.
Yes.
Edited by William Minter. So yeah, I mean, I think you will find him. That speech is probably in the collection.
Yes. Again, this issue of the ecological unity. Go ahead, Laura.
And I would just say, rhetorically, he really resists being associated only with nonviolence. And I just quickly pulled up in what we have published. In 1968, he's talking about the Vietnam War, and he says the war has put the nation in a position of defending violence it creates abroad, but denounces violence at home. And he's constantly pushing back, saying, first of all, what is violence? But also really armed, rhetorically, again, I'm not speaking of his actions, but his speeches do not engage nonviolence as the only tactic. And he finds that it seems almost offensive because of all the ways that can be used to subject people.
And speaking of this question of violence, he was wont to say that people, that those in power want to assume or arrogate to themselves the sole power of violence. He says, for me, violence is sitting in a classroom for 12 years but receiving a third grade education. So he was alert to the ways in which terminology got used to oppressive ends. I mean, he was very strong on condemning questions of austerity, to relieve the government of its responsibilities to the people. So again, he was himself a rhetorician, but also keenly alert to the ploys of certain rhetorical concepts used against people, especially the marginalized and the poor. Does anybody have anything? I wanted to leave us with a very funny line. Okay, go ahead, Derrick.
Well, we were talking about nonviolence and Professor Bond. Are you familiar, anyone familiar with anything he might have said about his course with Dr. King in 1961?
Yeah.
On social philosophy regarding nonviolence?
Oh, not necessarily regarding nonviolence, but he often alludes to that course. And he would tell his story and then tell you that was apocryphal about I have a dream. And so that I don't know. But again, this is the beauty of this archive, because we will be able to search for that information. Does he talk about the course he took with King specifically on this question of nonviolent resistance? Clearly, he would, given the fact that his colleague would go on to write, this nonviolent stuff can get you killed. You know, he would be aware, not just within the SNCC community, but well before SNCC and well before even the civil rights movement. The notion that nonviolent resistance was the only route to freedom and liberation was clearly, the history does not bear that out. You know, there are many people, and another book, Negroes with Guns. So again, we will be able to answer the question with more precision. But for now, we can clearly say these debates are roiling between and among Bond and his peers and associates in SNCC.
But you know, one thing that comes through in the speeches is he's constantly talking about the importance of the political process and political engagement, you know, for young people and voting. I mean, you know, in the piece on, I guess, youth as a force for social change, he really talks about the political process and the importance of voting. So, you know, I think that's really important.
Indeed.
And I do, since we're talking about young people getting involved, etc., I remember on many occasions when I was with him at events and people would say to him, students at UEA often would say to him, well, what can we do? You know, what can we do in this environment, in this day? And he would just say, it doesn't matter, just do something.
Exactly.
Just do something, just take a step in those waters. And I think he was really saying, once you get invested, as you have, it will carry you forward. You know, it will move you forward to the next step and the next step and the next step.
Absolutely. In fact, one of his last interviews was with the members of the Dream Defenders in Florida. This is near his death. And he is once again saying essentially the same thing by revisiting his history. He says, well, you know, when we started to get involved, it wasn't that we had some big blueprint or map. It wasn't that we said, all right, we see ourselves as creating SNCC and SNCC is going to be. He says, no, we just acted. Again, we were just ordinary people seizing a moment. And that, again and again, he stressed that fact. It isn't about always having a script or having a blueprint, but simply getting in the water, as you say, doing something. We've been talking about fairly weighty issues, and I wanted to leave us with a sense of Julian Bond as a very funny man. Yes, Laura says dad jokes. He would tell this joke all the time, and toward the end, I would pretend that he had never told it to me before. I would want to appear salacious, but he would say, how did you get to be a Raylette, meaning one of Ray Charles' backup singers? You let Ray. And he would just tell this joke all the time. But I wanted to leave you with another sense. He was a great fan of humor, loved Richard Pryor, loved comedians, and I was so happy that at the gala for him in 2012, Wanda Sykes and Chris Tucker were MCs. They were chosen precisely because Julian was such a fan of comedy. So I'm going to leave you with this. He was one to tell the story of an event at which Georgia Governor Lester Maddox was to join him, but declined to show up. Bond goes, speaking to the audience. The governor wanted to be here, but there was a fire at the mansion. Don't be alarmed. Nobody was injured. The fire did, however, destroy the library, and both of the books were burned. And the governor was particularly upset because one of them hadn't even been colored in yet. a meeting with Julian was the meeting when your sides were just sore from laughing. He was a really very, very funny man. So I am myself honored to be participating in this project. I'm grateful to my colleagues, to our students, for a process that will exceed my span in academia. But my hope is to work with others to lead these archives in a space where we will carry on, because this is about 20 years of work. This is about 20 years of work facing us with this archive. Thank you very, very much. And there are drinks outside the door. There's food back there. So stay if you can and mingle, and let's keep chatting. All right. Bye.